Colorado School of Mines. Professor Carr got his bachelor from Berkeley and his graduate study, MSc and PhD from University of Washington. And then he did his postdoc at École Normale Supérieure in Paris and at GILA at the Colorado University of Colorado, where lots of actually Nobel Prize winners came out from there. And he's now a professor at Colorado School of Mines. He has mentored a large number of students, about 95 students, and he has very high citations, about 12,000 citations, and authored 120 papers. He's a fellow at the National Science Foundation. He's a distinguished international fellow there, and at the National Academy of Sciences, Kavla Fellow, and then the Academy, the Alexander von Humboldt Fellow, and the Fellow of the American Physical Society. So we are pleased to have Lincoln Carr here, and he's going to talk about kind of unusual subject for us, which looks interesting: healing science, humanities divide. Please, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Good afternoon. It's a great honor to be here in the UAE. It's my first time in your country. I've traveled widely in the Islamic world, but I've never been to this nation, and I am so impressed. You have a beautiful mountain here. You have a very peaceful place for contemplation and thought. I think Al Ain is one of the best places to do studies in the world, and I say that having lived on 4 continents and been in 40 countries, so I'm very impressed. I'm going to start with Healing the Sciences, Humanities Divide, and then tomorrow I'll give a follow-up talk on the next quantum revolution, which is a practical outcome of what I talk about today. So please keep in mind, even though I'll be reading some poetry and going over about 1,000 years of development in human thought, including a lot of philosophy, all within an hour, it may seem very heady, not very practical, but they're very, very practical outcomes, technological outcomes for humanity that will change how we live. Okay, so please have that in mind. Great, so I'm in the physics department, but I'm also a part of the McBride Honors Program, and this is the honors program part of my work. Great. So the outline for the talk is I'll start with a story about whales. I'll talk about medieval Islamic quandaries and solutions, and I want to emphasize here that I have no doubt that there are people in this audience who have 10 times my expertise in the history of the sciences and thought in the Islamic world, and this is just my very naive take on things that I read and learned. I look forward to being corrected by experts in the audience at the end of my talk. And then I'll talk about the dualism of the Enlightenment. This is the Western piece and the frames of reference that developed in that time. I'll go forward and talk about present U.S. education quandaries and solutions, and then I'll tell a story about lucid dreaming, and finally I'll conclude and read a poem. Okay, so let me start with sperm whales. So sperm whales are the largest predator on Earth. They have the largest brain on Earth. It is a complex brain like ours, folded, convoluted. They dive to 2 kilometers. They stay under for up to an hour. Sperm whales hunt giant squid and fish by echolocation. They have senses that we can only barely imagine, using a resonance chamber in their heads. That's why they have a very large head. Sperm whales congregate in deep water canyons and along the edge of continental shelves where they hunt. And they're family-oriented. They're very similar to us. They have a life cycle just like people. They live for about 70 years. They have a long gestation time or pregnancy time. They're close with their young. They grow slowly, and they have infrequent pregnancies. So basically, they are something like we are, but in the sea. Okay. And I want to show you now a picture of sperm whales when they were first seen in large numbers outside of the water. It's from a particular event in 1979 on the west coast of the United States in Oregon. And what happened is 41 sperm whales all together one day beached, got stuck on the beach, and couldn't get off. So people wandered over. People are in amazement at sperm whales. They really didn't know much about sperm whales because they're so deep under the water and so powerful and so big, and they didn't know what to do. So people wanted to help these whales because they love these whales, especially in Oregon where they see them passing every year and they see them breaching on the surface and the spume, the plume coming out of their blowholes. And so they tried to start pulling them in, and I hope you see that this is a little bit absurd. Here is one person with a rope trying to pull a whale that weighs 15,000 kilograms back into the water. So people got together, and a lot of them pulled, and they tried to pull whales in. And when they tried to pull the whales back in, actually they did even more damage to the whales, because the ropes tore into their flesh. And the whales themselves were, in fact, already dying, because out of water, their body weight is so extreme that their very flesh began to hemorrhage out of the water. So in fact, it was a hopeless situation, and these whales were going to die. And they died slowly and painfully over 2 days. So by the next day, the local police force had come in, had put ropes around the whales. They allowed scientists to come in. By chance, there was a mammalogy conference, a marine mammalogy conference about an hour away, and so a couple of hundred scientists actually came to work on these whales and try to understand something about the whales, to have something out of this tragedy. So I'm going to read you a quote from the time. This is from Barry Lopez, who's a nature writer who wrote a very famous essay after this. And I thought it would be helpful if I put every quote that I read up on the screen and read from it so that you could read along with me. Mate's 27-year-old graduate student, Jim Harvey, arrived on the beach at dawn on Sunday. At the first sight of the whales from the top of the dunes, strung out nose to flukes in a line 500 or 600 yards long, the waves of a high tide breaking over them, Harvey simply sat down. Awestruck at their size and number, he felt deeply sad too. But as he drew near, he felt a rush of exhilaration because there was so much information to be gathered. He could not get over the feeling as he worked of the size of them. One afternoon, a scientist stood confounded in a whale's abdomen, asking a colleague next to him, "Where's the liver?" Deborah Duffield said of her experience on the beach, "It hurt me more than watching human beings die. I couldn't cope with the pain, the futility. I just turned into myself. It brought out the scientist in me." Another scientist spoke of his hostility toward the sullen crowd, of directing that anger at himself, of becoming cold and going to work. For Harvey and others, there was one incident that broke scientific concentration and brought with it a feeling of impropriety. Several scientists had started to strip blubber from a dead whale. Blubber is their flesh. Okay. Suddenly, the whale next to it began pounding the beach with its flukes. The pounding continued for 15 minutes, lifting and slamming the flukes to the left, lifting and slamming the flukes to the right. When the animal quieted, they resumed work. Scientists rarely get a chance to express their feelings, Harvey said. I was interested in other people's views, and I wanted to share mine, which are biological. I noticed some people who sat quietly for a long time behind the barriers in religious stances. I very much wanted to know their views. So many of the people who came down here were so sympathetic and full of concern, I wished I had the time to talk to them all. Harvey remembered something vividly. On the first day, he put his face near the blowhole of one of the whales. A cylinder of clean, warm, humid air, almost a foot in diameter, blew back his hair. So there were hundreds of scientists there. The scientists didn't know what to do. Some just cried. Some got angry. Some went and sat by themselves. They allowed only 4 kinds of people in. They allowed scientists to be with the whales. They allowed police officers to be with the whales. They allowed journalists to be with the whales. And they allowed the people who disposed of their bodies to be with the whales. What they didn't allow was anybody who'd ever written a story about a whale. They didn't allow a priest, an imam, or a rabbi. They didn't allow anybody from any part of the humanities to participate in this. In the humanities, for thousands of years, we have been developing an inner framework to deal with events just like this. Without the insight from the humanities, how will we deal with the tragedy of global warming when we have 1 billion people displaced by the rising seas? What will we do with these scientific quandaries? With that, I want to dive into the scientific thought that developed first in the Islamic world. And I'm going to talk about the quandaries or problems that people faced as well as the solutions that they came up with. So let's begin with Ibn al-Haytham. You may have heard that the scientific method was invented with Francis Bacon. This is absolutely untrue. The scientific method was invented at least twice before Tycho Brahe and Galileo and Francis Bacon in the 15th and 16th century. It was invented in the 11th century in China during the Song dynasty, and it was invented in the 11th century in the Islamic world in the Cairo Caliphate. So Ibn al-Haytham was famous for his work in optics, astronomy, mathematics, and the scientific method. He invented controlled testing, experimentation. He applied skepticism to his research. He used mathematical modeling just like we do today and combined it together with physical insight. And I'm going to read a quote from him. "The duty of the man who investigates the writings of scientists, if learning the truth is his goal, is to make himself an enemy of all that he reads and attack it from every side. He should also suspect himself as he performs his critical examination of it, so that he may avoid falling into either prejudice or leniency." So why did it take another 500 years for science to come into its full power? What was humanity working on during these 500 years? The economic conditions for science to exist absolutely occurred in the Islamic world and in the Chinese world at that time. So what were we doing? Okay, so to answer this question, I want to look at a person who, so far as I understand in Islamic writings, is called many times the Muslim. He is called sometimes the greatest Muslim after Muhammad, okay? And his name is Al-Ghazali. So perhaps some of you have studied him, yes? So Al-Ghazali, he lived in, and I'm sorry if I pronounce his name terribly, it's probably Ghazali or something, I don't know. So he lived from 1058 to 1111. He had a career centered around Baghdad. He was considered the greatest professor of his time, the greatest thinker of his time, okay? And after acquiring a great deal of fame in this context of a rich ferment of social paradigms, including, of course, the Islamic faith, the Greek philosophy that the Arabs discovered as they eventually conquered Byzantine and, moved around the whole Mediterranean world, early experimental science, as I described, having a rational foundation for ethics, for example, with the Mu'tazila, Sufism, many, many different movements. In all of this, he had a very serious personal crisis as the most famous professor of his time. And he abandoned the university. Can you imagine here a full professor who is the most famous professor at university one day saying, "I just can't take it," and getting up and leaving and going to another country and sitting by himself in a room for years, okay? This is basically what he did. And so during that time, he tried to face some very deep inner struggle that he had about the kind of thinking that Ibn al-Haytham was doing and other philosophers were doing. And he wrote a book called The Incoherence of the Philosophers. It's a very famous book. And so in this book and in his thinking, he divides what he called the philosophical sciences into 6 areas: mathematics, logic, physics, metaphysics, politics, and moral philosophy. Okay? And out of all of these areas, he felt that 5 of them matched his paradigm and were basically areas that he could approve of. In fact, he really emphasized that the people of his time, the Muslims around him, should learn these things and take them in deeply and have it deepen their own faith, right? But there was one area that he felt was taking people away from what he thought was true. And this was metaphysics. And metaphysics at his time included things like cosmology, what we would call, say, dark matter and dark energy today, or how long the Earth existed, okay? Things that are integral to the sciences today. But in his time, he saw that people doing metaphysics followed it blindly, and they didn't follow it with skepticism, and he was worried about that effect on the people around him. And so, in fact, he developed a kind of antidote to the kind of thinking that was going on at his time. It's a very radical idea. It's an idea that causality is immediate, that all things are immediately caused by God in that moment, right? And very loosely speaking, we would say that he saw all events as miracles. But this is the experience of the poets. Any poet will tell you they see every event as a miracle. Every event is extraordinary, yeah? And he really helped Sufism to come into mainstream Islam. Sufism was very much an expression of the inner world, and what he was able to do was to bridge this deep inner experience that he had really during his crisis, right, with all of this outer learning. So he made this rather extraordinary bridge. Okay, so that's in Eastern Islam. Let's go to Western Islam, okay, and talk about Ibn Rushd, who in Europe for some strange reason is called Averroes. I don't know why. He's Ibn Rushd, yeah? And so Ibn Rushd lived a little later, not much later. He lived from 1126 to 1198. He had a career in Al-Andalus, which was Spain and Morocco today. Okay? He was a true polymath, like Ibn al-Haytham. Yeah? So he lived in a time of political instability. There was a slow death of this 800-year empire, an empire in which Muslims, Christians, and Jews all lived together in peace and thought about the universe together. In fact, specifically, one of the major cities in that empire, Toledo, fell in 1085. That began the fall, and by 1236, Cordoba had fallen, and the brutal Inquisition followed, which killed many people, persecuted many intellectuals, ended that kind of tolerance that existed in that time. And in fact, you know, as a part of that political instability, his works were burned, and he was banished from the court. Okay? And his works were on logic, Aristotelian Islamic philosophy, theology, the Maliki school of Islamic jurisprudence, psychology, political and Andalusian classical music theory, geography, mathematics, medieval sciences of medicine, astronomy, physics, and celestial mechanics. I mean, it's incredible. Can you imagine anybody writing 80 books on all of these things today? So Ibn Rushd wrote a very famous book in answer to Al-Ghazali called The Incoherence of the Incoherence. And when he answered him by saying that events follow a natural law created by God, and that we can understand this natural law. Keep in mind that all of these writers and thinkers were all dedicated Muslims trying to understand how to relate to the world in their own way. Okay? Ibn Rushd had the advantage of living a little later and living in a very different civilization in Western Islam. And he was really able to defend metaphysics in a way where you could use rational thought, but not take things blindly, and use the skepticism in experimental science of Ibn al-Haytham, but use it on the metaphysical framework. For example, where does the world come from? So these new boundaries that, you know, he sort of opened, right? The way that he crossed this divide actually became an inspiration for Aquinas. Thomas Aquinas is considered by some the beginning of Western philosophy, right? And Aquinas, basically what he was a translator. So he learned Arabic really well, and he translated the works by Ibn Rushd, and then he explained them to people in a way they could understand, in particular to his own religious authority, the Catholic Church. And in the end, this became the foundation of Western secular thought in the sciences. So really it starts with Ibn Rushd. But you have to keep in mind that Ibn Rushd was responding to something that Ghazali did, and Ghazali was responding to something that Ibn al-Haytham and others, al-Farabi, etc., did. Okay. So that is how, that is a very brief synopsis of how the Islamic thinkers of this time dealt with the quandaries in their own civilization. And I hope you have a sense of why it took many hundreds of years to go from Ibn al-Haytham to what I'm about to explain, because there were a lot of things to work out about reconciling this inner framework that we developed for thousands of years and that was needed to understand what happened with these dying whales, to reconcile that with this outer measurement that we do, for example, in Ibn al-Haytham's optics, and we now do in the sciences. Okay. So let's go to Europe now. This is about the dualism of the Enlightenment, okay, and frames of reference. And when you think about frames of reference, the first thing you should think about is Descartes. So René Descartes, he lived from 1596 to 1650. He was French, but he traveled very widely. His career was centered in the Netherlands. He did all of his best work in the Netherlands, but he actually wandered all over Europe. He was even a military officer. He was a very extraordinary human being. And once again, he was a polymath. A polymath is someone who can work in many fields at once. And in particular, he bridged algebra and geometry. And those were two very different ways of thinking about the world. If you've been taking algebra and geometry, probably for you, bridging them has actually been difficult as a student. It's still difficult for me sometimes. In fact, loosely speaking, we can say that Einstein did that in the theory of relativity. So he was a philosopher. Many people call him the father of Western philosophy, not because he answered the questions, but because he asked the right questions. So what kinds of questions was he asking? Well, he, you know, like the devout Muslims that I just described, he was a devout Catholic, and he looked for a way forward. The Catholic Church was not receptive of the kind of thought that he was doing. In fact, Galileo, just a little bit before him, had been imprisoned, you know, for making statements about the cosmology, again, metaphysics, right? And his way forward was dualism. And this dualism is still with us today. And in some sense, it's the theme of this whole talk, okay? And so the dualism is the mind-body divide. This mind-body divide is very significant. In his case, he explored this boundary, right, that exactly we're still facing. So his idea was, let's take knowledge, take human experience, and we'll put it in two boxes. Yeah? One box is the inner life of the mind, that inner world, what Ghazali tried to reconcile with Sufism. And the other box is this new thing that we're creating, starting with Ibn al-Haytham and many others. And for that, he created Cartesian coordinates. And hopefully, all of you have seen something like this. A plot of something as a function of something else with a curve. That all comes from his way of thinking. He wanted to invent a new frame of reference, and it was so powerful that when we talk about any kind of relationship now, we use plots like this. It doesn't matter what field you're in. Everybody knows this, right? Okay? And, you know, he asked things like, is psychology science? Can you understand psychology scientifically? Is human experience material, right? Now we have the Human Brain Project, and tomorrow, when I talk about the next quantum revolution, I'll actually start with the Human Brain Project because it's so significant. It's saying that scientifically we can get insight into our inner lives, and we're at a point where we can do that within a framework that is acceptable to most or all of the world. Okay. So let's talk about some of these boundaries and how they play out in terms of practical measurement. I started with Ibn al-Haytham. Let's talk about what happened in chemistry in the 18th and 19th centuries. So at this time in history, in the 18th century, there was the concept that living things should have a different set of laws than non-living things. And organic chemistry associated with living things should operate on separate principles from inorganic chemistry for non-living things. That's an example of the mind-body divide in this sort of two worlds idea, okay? And in particular, people started to do experiments to test this idea, like Ibn al-Haytham said. Now they were ready to do the experiments. They had enough of a framework to do it. So in 1816, Michel Chevreul converted animal fat soap, animal fat-based soap, to glycerol and fatty acids. That was an organic to organic conversion, and he did that. He never had to use a concept of a vital force to understand that chemical reaction. And then most importantly, in 1828, Friedrich Wöhler converted ammonium cyanate, which was an inorganic compound, to urea, which is a compound used in or found in human urine. And here's the actual chemical formulas. And you know, that showed that you could convert non-living things to living things, where in their mind, non-living and living was inorganic or inorganic chemistry. Many people say that is the beginning of chemistry, that experiment in 1828. So that's a bridging of those two worlds, the inorganic and the organic. In these days, we have books like this one by Nick Lane, which I highly recommend, and this book traces life from very early chemistry through geochemistry, through biochemistry, through early evolution, pretty much all the way up to us. And in fact, the only bridge that we're still missing is the prokaryote to eukaryote bridge. That's a very hard one to explain. Pretty much everything else, from chemistry up till now, we can trace scientifically all of those changes. Yeah? Has this made us any less in amazement at the universe? No, in fact, we have more amazement at the universe now. Okay, so, you know, we've come a long ways since Ghazali had to say, hey, let's put metaphysics down until we can learn to be better skeptics and more critical of our thinking. Okay, so in the last few hundred words, some very important new words have been invented. And I don't know the words in Arabic, but I hope you know that in English, these words are taken for granted, as if they've always existed, but they haven't. They're actually very new. So let's use one, okay, that you probably all know, energy, right? Energy first appears in Aristotle as energeia, but actually it's not the concept of energy we talk about today. We just grab that word and use it. In fact, the first place that energy starts really appearing is this vital force or vital principle. And that idea, the vital force or vital principle, was something that was for life only. It didn't apply to non-living things, okay? So in the 1850s, as we invented thermodynamics, we came up with ideas of kinetic and potential energy, right? And today, we say things like, I feel energetic. Nobody said that 400 years ago. They didn't say, I feel energetic, right? And we have entire industries like renewable energy science or the energy sector, so important here in the UAE. Yeah? All of that comes out of thinking about this word carefully. Another new word that you may think has been around for a long time is actually very new, and it's the word empathy. And so in English, we use this word a lot. It actually first appears in 1873 in a thesis in Germany where it's Einfühlung, so something like feeling into or infeeling. And then in 1909, a psychologist invents this term at Cornell University. This is where the US starts to become at least slightly important. And in fact, today we say, I empathize with you, right? I empathize with you. And if you think about what's tied to empathy, it's globalization, It's social networks, right? It's interconnection. Interconnection leads to entanglement, as I'll talk about in my talk tomorrow, right? That's a quantum concept. So, there are new words that are appearing, and these new words can appear because we've bridged worlds, right? We've bridged the inorganic with the organic. We've bridged, materialism with our inner experience, yeah? But we haven't completed that bridge. Let's talk about what's going on in US media. And I'm going to show you some images which might be a little bit offensive. These are sorts of things you see around the internet. Please keep in mind I'm just grabbing things from the internet. This is nothing I believe in. But I want to give you a sense of what's happening now in the US, at least in media, as far as how people regard the sciences. Okay? So first of all, you'll see things like GMO, right? Genetically modified organisms. GMO is a very basic technology, yeah? But in the media, you'll see things like GMO, and then why are our cancer rates so high, as if they're somehow connected, okay? Another example is pesticides. People imagine that pesticides get into DNA and that this must make you sick. And in the US, in fact, we now have two societies, one that eats expensive food and lives very well, and one that eats very cheap food and gets obese. And it's become a health crisis in the United States. Okay? You see really extreme things like this with vaccines. We had a recent outbreak of a disease in California because parents were not vaccinating their children because they imagined that vaccines give their children autism. Yeah? Okay. And then you find entire universities dedicated to quantum mechanics, which actually don't do quantum mechanics at all, but use quantum mechanics as a metaphor. So this is what I would call sciences in the media on the left, and all of this stuff is based on science that is very easy to demonstrate as incorrect. Okay, so they're all essentially based on conspiracy movements, very widespread in the US. Let's look on the right. So on the right, you see things like global warming hoax exposed. Okay, there are over 27 different simulations that agree on what is going on with global climate change. It is better established than the theory of gravity. Another nice example, evolution must be wrong. And, there's all sorts of alternate theories, for example, about this particular intermediate form between dinosaurs and birds. And then you find, entire groups that follow this idea of evolution as being a false theory, evolution as the most important theory in all of biology, right? And, you might say, well, okay, Professor Gard, this is stuff you found on the internet, this is some conspiracy, this is some extremist groups, people don't really think this way, right? Well, let's look at the numbers, okay? Is it conspiracy theory? If it is, why is it so pervasive in US society? Let me show you some statistics from the US, okay? And all of these statistics for education are taken from Gallup, which is a standard polling organization in the US. It's a reputable organization. Okay. 88% of Americans finish high school. Sounds good. Only 12% don't finish. It ought to be 100%, but anyway, the vast majority finish high school, right? So it shouldn't be a problem. On the other hand, over half of high school teachers in the US do not have a degree in science. That's a very important point. Okay, 73% of Americans don't have a 4-year university degree. So only about a quarter of Americans ever really get to finish university. Huh? Okay, what is the result? Actually, 42% of Americans believe evolution is a false theory and the universe was created 10,000 years ago. Almost the majority. So those are very important statistics. I'm going to read you some quotes from my home university. I'm at a polytechnic university, which is a very well-regarded university. It's amongst the top 100 universities in the world in the physical sciences. These are sort of the best of several states in my region around the US, and here's what they have to say about the humanities. Science is true, literature is opinion. How can you grade me down on my humanities paper when there's no right or wrong? It's not like this is a problem set. It all seems so fuzzy. Okay, in 1959, there was a scientist who was also a writer, and he wrote a very famous paper and then began to give speeches on it and eventually even wrote a book about it. His name was C.P. Snow. He was in the UK, and it's a statement about the two cultures, so let me read it to you. A good many times I've been present at gatherings of people who, by the standards of the traditional culture, are thought highly educated and who have with considerable gusto been expressing their incredulity at the illiteracy of scientists. Once or twice I had been provoked and have asked the company how many of them could describe the second law of thermodynamics. The response was cold. It was also negative. Yet, I was asking something which is the scientific equivalent of, have you read a work of Shakespeare? He goes on to write, I now believe that if I had asked an even simpler question, such as, what do you mean by mass or acceleration, which is the scientific equivalent of saying, can you read? Yeah? Not more than 1 in 10 of the highly educated would have felt that I was speaking the same language. So the great edifice of modern physics